Wealth, when it reaches heights unthinkable to ordinary men, becomes both a fortress and a prison. For Jonathan Whitmore, heir to a dynasty of steel and shipping, it was both. His empire sprawled across continents. Ships bearing his name carved paths through oceans. Towers of glass and steel rose in his honor, and politicians whispered his name in secret chambers where laws were written for the benefit of men like him. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video, because when you stop doing this, YouTube understands that you don't like this content and stops recommending good stories like this. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. But where there is power, there is envy. Where there is fortune, there is betrayal. Jonathan learned this truth not in boardrooms, not in glossy headlines or balance sheets, but in the violent rush of water as a river swallowed him whole. The night it happened was warm. The sky pressed low with clouds, and the city's heartbeat pulsed in neon and smoke. Jonathan had just left a gala, another charitable front, where cameras captured his smile while men in tuxedos and women in gowns toasted to his philanthropy. Few knew that behind the performance, Jonathan was a man besieged. Rivals circled like wolves, lawsuits pressed in, and whispers of treachery snaked even into his own boardroom. He never imagined the betrayal would come so swiftly, or from so close. The limousine slowed near the bridge, a route Jonathan had crossed countless times. His driver, a man he trusted, suggested a detour, citing traffic. Jonathan, distracted by messages pinging his phone, gave a distracted nod. He never noticed the way the driver's hands trembled on the wheel. He never noticed the shadowed figures waiting where the bridge dipped into darkness. By the time he did notice, it was too late. The doors flew open. Rough hands seized him, dragging him from the plush leather seat into the night. A bag was forced over his head, muffling his shout. His cufflinks, the same ones his father had given him before his death, scraped against the pavement as he struggled. He heard the river before he saw it, its roar amplified by the bag enclosing his face. Then the cloth was yanked away and the night air struck him like ice. Faces loomed, faces he knew. Not strangers, not faceless thieves. Men from his circle, partners. Friends who had sat at his table, shared his wine, toasted his victories. Their eyes now glinted with something colder than greed, something closer to hatred. "You had too much," one of them hissed, "and you thought it would last forever." Jonathan's protest caught in his throat. For the first time in years, words failed him. Hands shoved him hard. The rail struck his ribs and then air, a sickening drop, and then water closed over him like a tomb. The river was merciless. It clawed at him, spun him, dragged him under. His lungs screamed as icy currents pulled him deeper, smashing him against rocks hidden in the blackness. He thought of everything in those chaotic seconds, the empire he had built, the enemies he had underestimated, the family name he bore like armor. All of it seemed absurd now, as water filled his mouth and chest and the night swallowed him whole. But as darkness claimed him, as his body surrendered, something intervened. Arms strong, desperate arms, hands gripping his collar, pulling, dragging. A face appeared above him, a face dark as night, framed in wet curls, eyes blazing with determination. A woman's voice shouted over the roar of the river, though he could not make out the words. All he knew was that she was pulling him inch by inch toward life. Her name was Naomi. To the world, she was invisible, a maid, a cleaner in houses where people like Jonathan never noticed the faces behind lowered eyes. She had been working late, crossing the river path on her way back from a second job. When she saw the men, saw the struggle, saw the billionaire flung like garbage into the torrent, and she did what no one else would have done. She dove. The current tore at her as well, dragging her under, but Naomi had grown up by rivers, her muscles hardened by years of labor. She fought with everything in her body, hauling the man's heavier frame against the pull of death. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, but inch by inch she forced them upward until at last her head broke the surface. Jonathan coughed violently, choking, barely conscious. Naomi locked her arm around his chest and kicked with all her strength, guiding them toward the muddy bank. The river tried to claim them again, slamming them against roots and branches, But Naomi would not let go. At last, gasping, trembling, she dragged him onto the shore. His expensive suit clung to him like lead, his jeweled cufflinks gleaming faintly under the moon. He lay limp, coughing weakly, the life in him flickering. Naomi fell beside him, her chest heaving. Rain began to fall, mingling with river water, drenching them both. For Jonathan Whitmore, the world had inverted in a single night. Moments ago, he had been surrounded by power and luxury. Now he lay in the mud, saved by a woman society would never have allowed into his boardrooms. His mind reeled with shock, his body weak, his pride shattered. But one truth burned in him even through the fog of exhaustion. Someone had tried to kill him, and they would believe he was dead. Naomi, this stranger, had pulled him back from the grave. But with that act, she had placed herself in the line of fire. Because men who throw billionaires into rivers do not leave loose ends. The night deepened. Naomi struggled to her feet, glancing down at the man she had saved. She recognized him. Everyone in the city knew the Whitmore face. He was on billboards, in newspapers, his wealth the stuff of endless gossip. What she did not know was why he had been attacked, or what saving him would mean for her. But as she watched his eyes flutter open, his lips gasping for air, she knew one thing with certainty. He would not survive without her. Not the night, not the betrayal, not the storm already closing in. Naomi took a step closer, her shadow falling across him. The rain poured harder, lightning flashing over the river. And in that instant, Jonathan Whitmore, the billionaire whose name commanded empires, was entirely in the hands of a woman the world never saw. The rain did not let up. It pelted the earth, carving rivulets in the mud, drumming on Jonathan's soaked clothes and blurring the line between river and storm. His body lay heavy, weighed down by water and exhaustion. Each breath came jagged, wheezing through lungs still half drowned. Naomi crouched beside him, trembling herself, but steady enough to press a hand against his chest. She felt the rise and fall, weak, uneven, but present. He was alive, against all odds. The man everyone believed untouchable had been dragged back from death by the hands of a woman who lived invisible at society's edges. "Stay awake," she whispered. Though she doubted he heard her. Her voice was swallowed by the storm. Her eyes scanned the darkness. The bridge was distant now, hidden by trees and rain. But Naomi's instincts screamed that danger lingered. Those men hadn't thrown him into the river just to leave. They would check. They would make sure. She looked back at the man. His fine watch cracked, his cufflinks still glittering faintly in the flashes of lightning. He was marked by wealth in a way that could not be hidden. If she left him here, he would die. If she tried to carry him into the open, he might be found and finished. Naomi's heart pounded. She had already made one impossible choice by leaping into the river. Now she faced another, whether to let fate finish what it had started, or to take this man deeper into her world, into the shadows where he might survive. Her decision came as naturally as breath. She would protect him. Jonathan drifted in and out of consciousness as Naomi dragged him away from the riverbank. He felt the earth beneath him change, mud giving way to gravel, gravel to the rough boards of a wooden floor. The smell of damp clothes, soap, and cooking oil filled his senses. Voices whispered, though he could not make out the words. When he opened his eyes again, dim light flickered from a kerosene lamp. He was lying on a thin mattress in a narrow room. The sheets smelled of lavender and hard work. His body ached, every muscle sore, his throat raw. And then he saw her, Naomi, seated in a rickety chair, her clothes still damp, her eyes heavy but alert. Her skin gleamed in the lamplight, her curls now wrapped in a scarf. She looked nothing like the polished faces Jonathan was accustomed to. No jewels, no tailored gowns, no painted smiles. But there was strength in her posture, a fierce dignity that startled him. "You're safe," she said quietly, as though speaking to a child. "But you can't stay here long." Her voice pierced the fog of his mind. Safe? He barely knew what that word meant anymore. For hours, Jonathan lay in silence, listening to the storm outside. His mind replayed the betrayal, the familiar faces twisted by greed, the shove, the river swallowing him whole. Rage simmered beneath his weakness. He, Jonathan Whitmore, reduced to a fugitive in the hands of strangers. But not strangers, he reminded himself. A stranger, One woman, Naomi. She moved around the small space with practiced quiet boiling water, wringing cloths, pressing them to his forehead. Her hands were rough, calloused from labor, but gentle in their touch. She never asked for thanks. She never lingered for praise, and Jonathan, for the first time in his life, felt the sharp sting of dependency. He who commanded armies of staff with a word now owed his survival to the mercy of one woman who had no reason to save him. It unsettled him more than the betrayal itself. As dawn broke, the storm eased, leaving the city washed in gray. Naomi opened the window slightly, letting in air heavy with river mist. "You need to keep still," she told him, her tone firm. "Your ribs are bruised, maybe cracked, and you're weak. If you go back out there now, they'll finish what they started." Jonathan managed a rasping whisper. "They think I'm dead." Naomi's eyes flicked toward him. "Good. Let them think it." The finality in her voice silenced him. Over the next days, Jonathan's strength returned slowly. Naomi worked quietly around him, rising before dawn to leave for her jobs, returning late with food she could barely afford. She shared what little she had without hesitation. Half her portion of rice, the last of her tea, blankets she'd mended countless times. Jonathan watched her with a mixture of bewilderment and guilt. He was a man accustomed to abundance, to excess. She was a woman who lived on scraps, yet she gave them freely. Once, in the quiet of night, he asked, "Why did you save me?" Naomi paused, folding a worn shirt in her hands. Her gaze lingered on the fabric before lifting to him. "Because no one else would have," she said simply. Her answer struck deeper than any accusation. Jonathan realized then what it meant to be invisible in his world, that countless lives like hers existed just beyond his notice, carrying burdens he never imagined. And yet, when his empire crumbled in an instant, it was one of those unseen souls who had given him back his life. But survival was not enough. Jonathan's mind churned with questions, with plans, with fury. The men who had betrayed him were no small rivals. They were sharks in tailored suits. And by now, they were circling his fortune. He imagined the board convening in his absence, drafting lies for the press, perhaps even declaring his death to the markets. Billions hung in the balance. His empire could be dismantled piece by piece before he ever emerged. The thought twisted in his chest. He could not stay hidden forever. Yet Naomi's warning echoed in his mind. "If you go back out there now, they'll finish what they started." He was a billionaire stripped of power, a king without a throne, alive only because the world thought him drowned. For the first time in his life, Jonathan had no control. Naomi, meanwhile, carried her own burdens. She worked tirelessly in wealthy homes, scrubbing floors and polishing furniture for families who would never speak her name. Her skin and accent marked her as different, lesser in their eyes. She endured whispers, dismissals, the casual cruelty of those who believed her existence was confined to servitude. Yet in her small apartment she was sovereign. She chose compassion when the world offered her none. She chose to save a man who would never have looked twice at her before. And as the days stretched, Jonathan saw her strength more clearly. Not the strength of wealth or influence, but the kind born of survival, of enduring injustice and refusing to break. It humbled him. Still, the storm outside their fragile sanctuary grew louder. On the fourth night, as Jonathan dozed in uneasy sleep, Naomi returned from her shift with eyes sharp and wary. She closed the door softly, bolted it, and stood listening. Jonathan stirred. "What is it?" Naomi's voice was hushed, urgent. "I heard something. At the house tonight, the people I work for, one of the guests, he was talking on the phone. They said your company is already moving without you. They said the problem is taken care of." Jonathan's blood ran cold. "The problem," he repeated bitterly. "Me," Naomi nodded. "If they find out you're alive—" Her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Jonathan sat up despite the pain in his ribs. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of betrayal pressing harder than ever. His empire was being stolen piece by piece. His name, his legacy, everything he had built. It was slipping through his fingers while he hid in a stranger's home. And yet, if he revealed himself now, he risked more than fortune. He risked his life. Naomi crossed the room, crouching before him. For the first time, Her eyes softened, less guarded. "You're not ready to fight them yet," she said quietly. "But you will be. Until then, you'll have to trust me." Trust. The word felt foreign on Jonathan's tongue. He had built a life on contracts, on lawyers, on guarantees carved into stone. Trust was for fools. And yet he looked at Naomi, the woman who had dived into a river for a stranger, who now risked everything to shelter him, and realized he had no choice. The world believed him dead. His enemies controlled his empire. His survival rested in the hands of a maid who owned nothing but her courage. Jonathan Whitmore, billionaire, had fallen as low as a man could fall, and only Naomi stood between him and oblivion. But outside, forces were moving. Rumors spread in hushed circles. Papers whispered of a mysterious disappearance. Stocks shifted. And in the corners of the city where shadows did their work, men asked quiet questions. Had the river truly claimed Jonathan Whitmore? Or had someone seen him crawl back from the depths? The first answer would leave his empire in their hands. The second would demand another attempt to finish the job. And one man, his face cold and familiar, was already on the trail. Jonathan Whitmore had once lived in penthouses, where the city stretched below him like a kingdom. He had eaten at tables where chandeliers glittered overhead, and power was passed between men with polished smiles and sharpened knives. He had spoken to presidents and kings and called them by their first names. But now, he lived in a room no larger than a closet, where plaster cracked above his head, and a single kerosene lamp fought back the dark. His meals were bowls of rice and broth. His company was silence, except for Naomi. Days blurred into nights, and though his body healed, his mind grew restless. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. The empire he had built from steel and stone, contracts and cunning, was slipping further from his reach each day he lingered in hiding. Yet Naomi insisted he stay, warning that stepping outside would mean death. It was a strange prison, saved not by walls or locks, but by loyalty to the one person who had no reason to give it. Jonathan began to see pieces of Naomi's life as the days unfolded. She rose before dawn, tying her scarf tightly, gathering her tools, and leaving for her jobs in the mansions of the wealthy. She returned late, her body weary, her hands cracked from chemicals, but her eyes still bright and alert. Sometimes she told him fragments of what she overheard in those homes. Careless gossip from women dripping in jewels, drunken boasts from men who thought the maid invisible. Naomi carried back whispers like a secret courier, delivering them to Jonathan, who pieced them together like shards of broken glass. It was from her that he learned the board had convened without him, that his name was whispered in past tense, as though he had already been buried, that markets were bracing for announcements that would reshape his empire. And it was from her that he learned one chilling detail. A man named Victor Hale had stepped forward, filling the void his death left behind. Victor Hale. The name cut Jonathan like ice. A man he had once trusted, once raised from nothing into the corridors of wealth. Victor had been at his side in boardrooms, had signed deals with him, had toasted victories with the same glass. Jonathan had believed him loyal. Now he understood. It was Victor's hand behind the betrayal. Victor's voice that had whispered of opportunity, of inheritance. Victor's ambition that had shoved him into the river. Rage burned inside Jonathan, sharper than pain, stronger than fear. He wanted to rise that instant, to storm into the offices that bore his name and tear back what had been stolen. But when he tried to stand, his ribs screamed in protest, and Naomi pushed him gently back to the mattress. "Not yet," she warned. "You go out there now, you won't last an hour. They'll put you in the ground for real." Her words were not cruel, only true. Jonathan knew it, and that truth gnawed at him more than any wound. One evening, as the city's lights flickered faint through Naomi's window, she returned with eyes wide, her voice urgent. "They're looking," she whispered as she bolted the door. "Someone came to the house I was working at tonight, asking questions. About the river, about anyone who might have seen something. They're not done. They don't believe you're gone." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Who?" Naomi's lips pressed together. "A man with a scar. He didn't give a name, but he was asking too many questions in too many places. He'll find his way here if we're not careful." Jonathan's memory sharpened. The scar, he knew it. one of Victor's enforcers, a shadow who had trailed him at events, always silent, always watching. A man who only appeared when intimidation was needed. If he was moving, then Victor's patience was wearing thin. Naomi began to take greater risks to protect him. She shifted her working hours, changed her routes through the city, spoke less and listened more in the homes where she scrubbed and polished. She learned to sift gossip from strategy, catching the moments when wealthy tongues loosened after wine. Jonathan, confined to her room, began writing notes on scraps of paper she brought back. Names, dates, whispered alliances. He built a picture of the conspiracy as best he could, connecting threads with the precision of a man who had once mapped empires. But with each note, with each piece of the puzzle, one truth grew clearer. Victor was not acting alone. Behind him were others, board members who had waited for Jonathan to stumble, competitors who envied his reach, politicians who had tired of his power. Together they had formed a circle of wolves. Together, they had pushed him into the river, and unless he struck back, they would finish their feast with his legacy. Yet striking back required more than rage. It required proof, allies, strategy. And Jonathan had none of those. What he had was Naomi. At first, he had seen her only as a rescuer, a caretaker, but slowly he began to recognize something more. Naomi had a way of moving through spaces unnoticed, of gathering information without drawing suspicion. She had grown up in a world that dismissed her presence, that saw her only as hands for labor, but she had turned that invisibility into a shield, and now perhaps a weapon. "You can hear things I never could," Jonathan told her one night, his voice low. "See things I never saw. They look right past you. That makes you stronger than they realize." Naomi looked at him surprised, almost suspicious. No one had ever spoken of her invisibility as strength before. "I don't want their world," she said softly. "I just want to survive it." Jonathan's gaze was steady. "So do I." And in that moment, a strange partnership began to take form, between the man who had once ruled the city and the woman who scrubbed its floors. But partnerships invite danger. The scarred man drew closer. Naomi spotted him once on her walk home, his shadow long against the street lamps. Another night she saw him linger near the market, his eyes scanning faces with cold calculation. He was hunting, patient and deliberate, and Jonathan, restless in his confinement, knew it was only a matter of time before hiding was no longer enough. One night, Naomi returned home pale and shaken. She shut the door quickly, leaning against it. "They know," she whispered. "They don't have proof, but they suspect. They think someone pulled you from the river. They're searching the workers' quarters now, asking questions about anyone who came home late that night." Jonathan sat up, his heart pounding. "They'll trace it back to you." Naomi nodded, her voice trembling but steady. "I know." Jonathan felt the weight of her sacrifice crash upon him then. She had risked everything. Not just her life, but her livelihood, her fragile place in a city that had no mercy for women like her. And she had done it for him, a man she should have despised. For the first time, Jonathan Whitmore felt something unfamiliar burn in his chest. Not rage, not fear, but guilt. The following day, Naomi did not return home at her usual hour. The minutes dragged into hours. Jonathan paced the narrow room, each breath sharp with dread. The lamp burned low, the walls pressed close. When the door finally creaked open, Naomi staggered inside, her clothes torn, her face marked with dirt. Jonathan rushed forward, catching her as she nearly collapsed. "What happened?" His voice shook with a mix of fury and fear. Naomi's eyes were glassy, her breath ragged. "They followed me," she whispered. The scarred man, he asked questions. "Too many questions. I tried to slip away, but..." Her words broke into silence. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. The betrayal that had once drowned him now rose again, sharper than ever. He could no longer sit idle. He could no longer wait. Victor had tried to erase him. The scarred man hunted him still. And now Naomi, the only soul who had stood between him and death, was paying the price for his survival. Something inside Jonathan shifted then. He was no longer just a man in hiding. He was a man preparing for war. But even as his resolve hardened, the walls around them seemed to close in. Footsteps echoed too near their door. Shadows lingered too long in the alleys outside. The scarred man had not yet found them, but he was close. And Jonathan knew that if they did not act soon, Naomi's home would become their tomb. The rain had passed, but the air still clung with the damp weight of storm. Jonathan stood at the window of Naomi's narrow apartment, staring into the city streets that stretched below. Once those streets had felt like veins of his empire, every light in every skyscraper, a reminder of his reach, every car that passed a testament to his influence. Now the same streets looked hostile. Every stranger's glance felt like a threat. Every shadow carried the shape of the scarred man who hunted him. Jonathan clenched his fists against the windowsill. He had been still too long. Patience was a virtue for kings, but he was no longer a king. He was prey, and prey that lingered became carcass. Behind him, Naomi stirred. She had cleaned the cuts on her arms from the night before, though bruises still darkened her skin. She moved slowly, but her eyes carried the same sharpness that had saved him in the river. "You're restless," she said quietly. Jonathan turned toward her, his jaw tight. "I cannot sit here while Victor dismantles everything I built, and while his dogs circle closer to your door." Naomi lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands. "And what do you think you can do? Walk into your office and demand it all back? You're not ready. They'll kill you before you open your mouth." Her words cut because they were true. Jonathan's body still ached, though less than before. His wealth had become a noose, and every connection he once trusted now served his enemy. But there was something Naomi had not considered, or perhaps had considered, but dismissed. Jonathan's mind. He had not built his empire with muscle. He had built it with strategy, with foresight, with a talent for turning whispers into weapons. His body might still be weak, but his mind was sharpening with every passing day. "They believe me dead," Jonathan said slowly. "That is our advantage. We will not waste it." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "We?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. His gaze locked on hers. "We, because without you I would already be in the ground. And without you I will not see them coming. You've walked invisible through the world they control. That makes you more dangerous than any ally I've ever had." Naomi's lips parted, startled by the weight of his words. She shook her head. "I clean their floors. I carry their dishes. They don't see me because I don't matter to them." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice hard. "And that is why you matter. They underestimate you. They see nothing, so they guard nothing. You can slip where I cannot, hear what I cannot, move where I cannot. You are not powerless, Naomi. You are invisible, and that is a power no one has ever given you credit for." Silence filled the room. Naomi's hands trembled slightly, as though Jonathan had struck a truth she had long buried. For years, invisibility had been her curse, but in his words she saw it reframed, transformed into strength. Still, she whispered, "Even if that's true, what good does it do? You have no army, no allies, only scraps of gossip and paper." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes burning with the fire of a man reborn. "An empire can fall to whispers. It always has." The plan began in fragments. Naomi would listen more carefully, ask careful questions when it seemed natural, and carry back threads of information. Jonathan would weave those threads into a net, a picture of Victor's scheme, his allies, his weaknesses. But Jonathan knew they needed more than whispers. They needed proof, and proof in Victor Hale's empire was guarded like treasure. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Naomi's work took her into the homes of men and women who now spoke Jonathan's name, as though it were a ghost story. She overheard plans, new contracts being signed under Victor's command, assets being moved overseas, foundations being shifted in Jonathan's absence. At night, she returned with these fragments, and Jonathan sat hunched over the small table, scribbling notes until the pages looked like maps of war. Piece by piece, he built the image of a coup. Swift, precise, orchestrated long before his fall. Victor had not acted alone. Half the board had pledged loyalty to him, tempted by promises of greater shares. Politicians had been bought to smooth regulatory hurdles. Even rival companies had circled like vultures, eager for scraps of his empire. Jonathan studied the picture with a strategist's eye, and he saw the cracks. Greed held them together, But greed also tore alliances apart. Victor's circle was powerful but fragile, and if Jonathan could widen the cracks, the empire could crumble before it fully solidified. But that required more than Naomi's ears. It required risk. The risk came sooner than either expected. One night, Naomi returned home with panic etched in her face. "They're close," she gasped. Too close. The scarred man. He came into the kitchen at one of the houses. He said they had word someone survived the river. He asked if anyone had seen a stranger, someone hiding. He's searching every worker's quarter now. Jonathan's breath caught. The noose was tightening. "They'll come here," Naomi continued, her voice trembling. "It's only a matter of time." Jonathan paced the small room, his mind racing. If the scarred man searched Naomi's building, they would be trapped like rats. He could not allow her to pay the price for his survival. "We need to move," Jonathan said sharply. Naomi stared. "Move where?" "You have nowhere." "I have nowhere." "They control everything." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "Then we move into the shadows they do not control." Naomi frowned, not understanding. Jonathan's lips curved into the faintest, coldest smile. "The streets. The places even Victor Hale fears to touch. You saved me from the river. Now we'll dive into another river. The one made of men and women he thinks too small to notice. The forgotten. The invisible. Your world," Naomi's breath caught. She realized what he meant. Her community. The neighborhoods overlooked by power, dismissed as unworthy. Places where maids, cleaners, drivers, porters, and laborers lived. Places where men like Victor Hale never bothered to look. Jonathan turned to her. "If we hide among them, he'll never see us. And from there, we strike." Naomi shook her head, torn between fear and awe. "You don't belong in my world." Jonathan's eyes burned with determination. "I didn't belong in the river either. But here I am." And so, under the cover of night, they left the apartment. Naomi guided Jonathan through alleys and side streets, carrying only what little they could. His body was still weak, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Every shadow felt like pursuit, every echo a warning. Finally, they reached the district Naomi had called home before she scraped together enough to rent her small room. Narrow streets wound like veins, lined with crumbling brick buildings, crowded markets, and voices speaking in tongues Jonathan had never cared to learn. Here, the powerful never came. Here, Victor Hale's men would not think to look, at least not yet. Naomi led him into a building where families lived stacked upon one another, where walls were thin and laughter still echoed despite poverty. She spoke with neighbors who welcomed her warmly, and when she introduced Jonathan as a distant cousin in need, no one asked more. In this world, survival required discretion. Jonathan, who had lived among wolves in tailored suits, found himself among people who had nothing yet gave what little they had without question. It unsettled him and humbled him. For the first time, Jonathan understood Naomi's strength. She had grown from this soil, where dignity was forged in hardship, where kindness survived in the cracks wealth had abandoned. And he realized, if he was to reclaim his empire, it would not be through the men who betrayed him. It would be through the people they ignored. Days passed in this new refuge, and Jonathan adjusted to the rhythm of Naomi's world. He spoke with men who drove trucks, with women who cleaned offices by night, with children who darted barefoot through the streets. They were curious about him, but respectful of Naomi's word. Slowly, Jonathan began to see opportunity. These were the eyes and ears of the city. The drivers who overheard boardroom secrets, the janitors who saw documents left on desks, the servers who listened to drunken confessions. They were invisible, yes, but invisibility carried knowledge, and Jonathan was a man who could turn knowledge into power. Yet even as he began to rebuild his foundation from the shadows, danger grew. One evening, Naomi returned from her errands with dread in her voice. "They're closing in. The scarred man is paying the police. They're raiding places, workers' quarters, markets. They say they're looking for smugglers, but it's you. They're searching for you." Jonathan's heart pounded. Time was running out. And then, as if fate wished to tighten the blade against his throat, Naomi added, "And I heard something else. They're planning an announcement tomorrow. Victor Hale is calling a press conference. He's going to declare you officially dead." Jonathan froze. Dead. Officially. With those words, Victor would seal his empire. With those words, markets would close around him. Contracts would shift. Inheritance would be claimed. He would vanish not only from life but from history. Jonathan's fists clenched. He would not allow it. He could not allow it. His voice, when it came, was steel. Then tomorrow, Victor Hale will have his spectacle. But it will not end the way he thinks. Naomi's eyes widened. What are you planning? Jonathan turned toward her, a fire burning in his gaze that had not been seen since before the river. War. The night before the press conference was a night without rest. Jonathan sat at the small wooden table in Naomi's borrowed room, the flicker of a single candle carving shadows across his face. Before him lay scraps of paper, notes, names, alliances, betrayals, all mapped in the hand of a man who had once orchestrated empires. Naomi moved quietly around him, her movement steady though her heart was restless. She watched him scribble with the focus of a man who had already seen the battlefield in his mind. "They'll kill you if you show yourself," she said finally, her voice heavy. Jonathan did not look up. "Then they will try. But if I let them declare me dead tomorrow, they will not need to kill me. My empire will be gone. My name will belong to Victor Hale. History will write me as a man who drowned in a storm. No, that I will not allow." Naomi's hands tightened on the back of the chair. "And what of the people here? My neighbors? My friends? If you bring war into these streets, they will suffer." Jonathan's pen stilled. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to hers. His eyes, tired yet burning, softened at her words. "I will not let harm come to them. Naomi, you pulled me from the river when I was nothing. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me time. Time to rise again. If anyone deserves protection, it is you and those you love." Naomi swallowed hard. She had lived her life without promises from powerful men. Yet somehow in Jonathan's words she sensed truth. Then how? She asked quietly. Jonathan leaned back, folding his hands together. "We do not fight them in boardrooms or back alleys. We fight them with the one thing they fear most, exposure. Tomorrow Victor Hale will stand before cameras and claim me dead. Tomorrow I will stand before those same cameras and prove him a liar." Naomi stared at him, stunned. "You mean to walk into his press conference?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "No, I mean to take it from him." The dawn came gray and heavy with mist. Across the city, news crews gathered outside Whitmore Tower, the headquarters of Jonathan's empire. A podium had been erected at the base of the marble steps. Reporters jostled for position. The air buzzed with anticipation. Victor Hale would speak at noon. But long before the sun reached its height, Jonathan moved through the underbelly of the city. Dressed in plain clothes borrowed from Naomi's neighbors, he looked nothing like the billionaire who once commanded headlines. His hair was unkempt, his face worn, his posture marked by weeks of pain, yet his eyes carried fire. At his side, Naomi walked swiftly, her scarf drawn tight. She had insisted on coming. No matter how Jonathan argued, she refused to let him face danger alone. "You'll need me," she said simply. "You may know their world, but I know how to slip through it." Jonathan did not argue further. He had learned that when Naomi spoke with such certainty, she was always right. They reached the tower through hidden routes, service corridors, delivery entrances, stairwells known only to those who cleaned the marble floors at night. Naomi's contacts had guided them, invisible hands moving in the shadows. For Jonathan, it was a revelation. He had built his empire on these towers of glass and steel, yet he had never known the arteries beneath them, the people who kept them alive, but whom no one saw. Naomi's world had opened those doors. At last, they reached a narrow maintenance hall that led to a service lift. From there, Jonathan could reach the stage before Victor, but the path was not empty. The scarred man stood waiting. His presence filled the corridor like a predator claiming its kill. The jagged mark across his cheek twisted as he smiled coldly. "I knew the river wasn't enough," he said, his voice like gravel. "Victor will be pleased to know I was right." Jonathan froze, his body taut. Naomi's breath caught beside him. The scarred man stepped closer, a pistol glinting in his hand. "It ends here, Whitmore. The world will still think you drowned. Only this time you'll stay under." Time slowed. Jonathan's mind raced. He had no weapon, no guard, no escape. For the first time since the river, he felt death's breath against his neck. But Naomi moved first. With the speed of instinct, she snatched a bucket from the corridor, left behind by some cleaner, and hurled it at the scarred man's head. Water and soap splashed across his face, blinding him for an instant. Jonathan lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into the man's chest. The pistol clattered to the floor, skidding across the tiles. The corridor exploded into struggle. Jonathan fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The scarred man was stronger, his fists brutal, his body unyielding. Jonathan's ribs screamed in agony with every blow. But then Naomi was there again, grabbing the pistol, hands trembling but steady enough to raise it. "Stop!" she cried, her voice fierce. The scarred man froze, his eyes flicking from Naomi to Jonathan. Slowly he sneered. "You don't have it in you." Naomi's hands shook, but her eyes blazed. She had lived her whole life dismissed, unseen, underestimated. Yet in that moment she stood taller than either man. Jonathan, gasping for breath, pressed a hand to her arm. "Naomi, don't," her gaze flickered to him. He shook his head. "We don't win by becoming them." The scarred man growled, but Naomi's resolve did not falter. Instead of pulling the trigger, she kicked the pistol down the hall, out of reach for all. Then, with a voice that rang sharper than steel, she said, "If you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me. And I promise you, you won't." The scarred man's sneer faltered. For a heartbeat he seemed unsure, not of Jonathan, but of the maid who now stood like a shield. And in that hesitation, footsteps thundered from above. Security, drawn by the noise, descended into the corridor. The scarred man glanced once at Jonathan, then melted into the shadows, vanishing before they arrived. Jonathan staggered, leaning against the wall. Naomi steadied him, her touch strong. "You saved me again," he whispered. Naomi's reply was steady. "Not just you. What comes next is bigger than you." Minutes later, Jonathan stood at the edge of the stage. The crowd outside roared with voices, cameras flashing as Victor Hale stepped toward the podium. Dressed in a flawless suit, his expression grave, Victor raised his hands for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "it is with heavy heart that I confirm what so many have feared. Jonathan Whitmore, visionary builder leader, has been lost to us. His tragic death in the river marks the end of an era. But let us not despair, for in his memory we will—" The doors behind him burst open. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Jonathan Whitmore himself stepped into the light. He looked nothing like the polished titan they remembered. His clothes were plain, his face drawn, his body marked by struggle. Yet his presence was undeniable. His voice, when it rang out, cut through the air like thunder. "Not dead, Victor." "Not yet," the crowd erupted. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing wildly. Shouts filled the air. "Whitmore alive! What happened in the river? Is this a coup?" Victor's face drained of color, his mask of control shattering. This is impossible." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. "You betrayed me. You sought to bury me. But I stand here now, alive, because truth cannot drown. You tried to silence me with water and lies. And now, before the eyes of the world, I reclaim my name, my company, and my life." The roar of the crowd drowned Victor's protests. What followed was chaos. The press tore into Victor with questions. Board members scattered like frightened birds. Jonathan seized the moment, announcing investigations, demanding audits, vowing justice. His words carried the weight of survival, of a man who had risen from the grave. But through it all, he never forgot the figure standing at the edge of the stage. Naomi, watching quietly, her scarf drawn close, her eyes steady. She asked for no recognition, no reward. But Jonathan knew, without her, this moment would never have come. She was the reason he lived. Weeks passed. The empire shook but did not fall. Victor Hale vanished into the shadows he had once commanded, hunted by law and rival alike. The board fractured, but Jonathan's survival restored enough faith to hold it together. And yet Jonathan himself was changed. He no longer saw his empire as invincible, nor himself as untouchable. He had looked into the river, into death, and had been pulled back not by wealth or power, but by the hands of a woman invisible to the world he ruled. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Jonathan found Naomi on a quiet street, carrying groceries for her neighbors. She looked at him with the same calm strength she always had. "You don't owe me anything," she said softly, before he could speak. Jonathan shook his head. "No, Naomi, I owe you everything." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile born of resilience. "Then use it well, not just for yourself, for everyone you never saw before." Jonathan met her gaze, and for once the billionaire had no words, only gratitude. And so the story of Jonathan Whitmore did not end in the river, nor in the boardroom, but in the quiet triumph of a truth too often forgotten, that sometimes the greatest empires are not saved by kings or crowns, but by those the world refuses to see. And in that truth, Jonathan found not only survival, but redemption.